Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Scott Samuelson and I'm a professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College on the Iowa City campus. Sounds like a sci-fi story, unmanned drones dropping bombs across the globe. But when we do imagine the story, is the country with the drones the good guys or the bad guys? We're now using drones to drop bombs in half a dozen countries, most of which we haven't declared wars against. Civilians have been killed, but so have terrorists. We severely damaged Al-Qaeda, and drones allow us to do so without putting our own troops in harm's way. Are drone strikes, as some argue, the illegal assassination of our enemies, or are they an ingenious new way of making us safe with a minimum of risk? Does drone technology make us more likely to launch strikes or more likely to land good ones? What new legal and ethical issues does drone warfare pose? We have a great panel on to talk about these issues. To my left, Paul Ronan, a former unmanned aerial vehicle, or drone, detachment commander. Thanks for being on, Paul.
Thank you, Scott.
Gary Seacard on the executive committee of the Libertarian Party of Iowa. Thanks for being on, Gary.
Thank you, sir.
And at the end, Bob Rush, an attorney at Rush & Nicholson. Bob, thanks for being on. Well, Paul, maybe I can start with you, and maybe you can just give us a little bit of background on drones. Or I know the Army likes to call them unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. Does the terminology bother you one way or the other there?
No, it doesn't bother me.
Okay. Well, can you tell us a little bit about, I mean, what is the range of what drones are doing right now for us in the military?
Well, there's actually a continuum of capabilities that you see in unmanned air systems, from tiny or backpack-sized UAVs up to ones as large as a fighter that can stay aloft for hours and hours and hours. Most aren't armed, although some are, obviously. Mm-hmm. And they have surveillance capabilities and weapons capabilities that are pretty similar to what you see in other manned aircraft. Mm-hmm. Their primary advantage is that they're cheaper, they are widely available, and
right.
There's no pilot at risk.
Right. And how precise are they?
They're as precise as anything else we have. They employ the same kind of munitions typically, and the cameras, sensors, whatever, are pretty similar to what you see on manned aircraft.
Well, I want to come back to you and your experience for sure, but let's get Gary in on this too. So does drone warfare pose new problems for us to be thinking about in your view?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question because there's really two aspects to that. The unmanned, nature of the aircraft, being a drone, isn't necessarily a problem so much as it is the way we've utilized it so far. If we were utilizing it for surveillance, obviously there may be some international laws or some other things that might be problematic, but we're not actively assassinating people or killing people that may be our enemies, utilizing surveillance capabilities.
Right.
The problem tends to manifest itself in the fact that the United States has a constitution that says this is how we treat people as the government, not as people, but as the government. And if they're going to use unmanned vehicles in which to kill people, that without a declaration of war, that becomes problematic.
Right, so there's a sense in which drone technology is so useful, we might want to say, that it poses this temptation to overstep our boundaries a little bit? Is that?
Well, you leave something in the hands of a politician, they're probably going to utilize it, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think the temptation's there to use something because now we don't put troops on the ground. We're not sending someone there. But even that's not necessarily true either. Some of the aiming technologies are laser focused and such, and they're still putting troops there, and they're still in harm's way then.
Right. Well, let me ask you the same question, Bob. I mean, are drones a kind of game changer? Are we entering into a new world that we need to rethink?
I see it as a brave new world, where the lines between war and surveillance become more blurred as the technology evolves, as we explore and test and challenge our perceived enemy or our enemy with new technology. I think it presents new challenges for us on balancing rights, as you point out. Does the enemy combatant have any rights? Well, limited rights, perhaps under certain international treaties. Does the enemy lined up at your border ready to attack you? Does or should he have any rights? These are big questions, I think, that are important for us as a community, as a nation, to address and deal with.
Yeah, and I hope that we can get to some of those this morning. Well, let's come back to Paul then and say, I mean, what do you think about the effectiveness of drones? And maybe we can start there with just how useful and effective are drones as part of our repertoire, our military repertoire?
Well, currently they're extremely useful, primarily for political reasons, as we've seen, because it's easier politically to employ these things rather than have manned aircraft. Although technologically, there's merely an increment from the existing technology. But what's interesting about these is that I think in the future, can be so much more use made of unmanned technology. People talk about the F-35 as the last manned fighter. So sometime 20, 30 years in the future, it's possible that the only type of combatant aircraft we have will be these unmanned systems.
Right.
And so will they be able to go out and find a target, find the right target on their own in the absence of a data link, et cetera? That's going to be a really interesting issue, something that we really need to start thinking about how to do.
And is there an ethical difference between a manned fighter going in and dropping a bomb and an unmanned a vehicle going in and dropping that bomb?
Currently, for what we have right now, there's no difference whatsoever because there's always a human in the loop, a human making the decision, a human exercising judgment, which is primarily what we have humans for. So a human has to look at the video, the surveillance results, the evidence, and decide whether or not to employ the weapon, and if so, when, how, what type of weapon, all the sorts of things that a pilot in an F-16 would do.
Right. Does that seem fair to you gentlemen, that there's no significant difference between an unmanned vehicle dropping a bomb versus a manned plane dropping a bomb?
Well, I think the point is very well taken, that there is a person involved in that loop. It may be a person now more removed from the scene of battle, but it's still a human being involved in
But someone who's now not directly at risk, right? I mean, someone who's not
making battle decisions, if you will.
Well, or making a battle decision, but someone who
may be safe from...
Who's safe, essentially. I mean, who might be in, Colorado, right? Or, far from the possibility of getting shot at. Does that change things at all, I guess I'm wondering.
I don't think legally it makes a difference as far as whether or not it's a manned or unmanned, as long as there's a human pushing the trigger, if you will.
Right,
as long as someone's actually dictating that action.
Right.
I think where you're going to see problems occur, especially legally, is what happens if they lose the data link to that aircraft and it's been given a mission to shoot something somewhere else, and it goes and does that without human intervention.
Right.
I think that's where you see the biggest risk.
Right, and that's, I think when we say the word drone, sometimes that's what conjures in people's mind is like some robot that's just going off and acting on its own almost, right? Which I suppose that's how you'd perceive it if it was dropping a bomb on you, but...
Well, it might be how you perceive it, but you'd probably perceive it the same way if it was an F-16 at 35,000 feet.
Right.
And speaking of risk, a pilot in Afghanistan flying up at high altitude is not in a much significant risk either.
Right.
And neither is the infantryman calling in the strike, for that matter. At least from the perspective of unless it's right in his neighborhood.
Right.
We've been moving away or executing fires from a distance since the days of World War I.
Or even before that, maybe a little bit. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a military term for that. I should have, like SOBA or something. What is it?
I don't know that, but
I don't know. But the idea being that it used to be, to kill someone you had to be right face to face, and that's slowly gotten more and more distant
as
technology has progressed.
Every time we've seen an advance in the technology, though, the one common denominator has been public resistance to the new technology.
Right.
Whatever we had in the past was better than what we have now, or more ethical somehow.
Right.
Which I think is kind of fuzzy thinking.
Well, okay, but let's go back to the effectiveness. Like, let's talk about, say, civilian casualties, or, I mean, do drones help us fighting a war to minimize civilian casualties? Do they increase the chance of them? Does it change things at that level at all in a way that we need to be aware of?
I think the increased surveillance capabilities we have reduce the possibility of civilian casualties just because you have more information about what's going on in the area.
Right.
If you make use of it.
Right.
Like I said, I think the biggest problem that we have as the United States is the fact that we wage a war without our own legal checks and balances in place to say that it is a war.
Right.
And then we carry out a drone attack on someone, and they may be killed. and yet we had no legal authority by our own Constitution to do so.
Right.
That's the slippery slope that we go down to with making something really easy to be done.
Right.
Because politicians will employ that. And that's one of the things that we have to watch out for, that I think that we have not done right in this current utilization of that technology. The technology itself is not problematic. It's the use of that technology.
Right. Okay, well, so let's get to that issue then. I mean, so that does, I mean, as I understand it, we're sending drones in and dropping bombs in 6 different countries or more, including Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Yemen, and we're not at war with these countries, we have not declared war with these countries. There are terrorists in these countries that we're concerned about. How are we supposed to sort that out, Bob? What are we supposed to think about?
When was the last war we declared?
Well, I know,
World War
okay.
II?
World War II.
Right.
And how many thousands of our troops have died in service to the
Right.
country in undeclared
Right,
war?
but is that, I mean, that doesn't necessarily get these wars off the hook. That might simply say, we've been blowing it now for a while. We should have declared war if we wanted to be at war,
I think
or else we should have
all the more
reined it
reason
in.
to be doubly sure and triply sure as we go forward with the new technology that we're going forward mindful of all the fallout, the collateral damage, the argument that a laser strike with a drone is far more humane or ethical than a blanket bombing of an area. And ethically, is there a ratio of killing bad guys and unfortunately innocents being killed in the process? Is there some acceptable ratio out there that drone warfare gives us?
Well, what do you think about this issue about, that drones make it so easy? The president will have just sort of remarkable power to launch drone strikes at whoever we think poses any kind of threat to us, and in a sense it allows us to have a kind of easy, light war with many countries all at once without ever really declaring war on a population or having to really think it through as a country. Just no, send the drones in and
Well, presidents have been doing that for a long time, actually. You may remember President Clinton authorized a cruise missile strike against a camp that Osama bin Laden was suspected of being in. And if you look at what he used, the cruise missiles, they share a lot of characteristics with drones. The only real characteristic they don't share is they're not reusable.
Right.
So,
if I remember right, that was right after the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and people thought that he was deflecting attention away from that scandal.
but one of the reasons he did it was easy. All it cost was money.
Right.
They cost $1 million or $2 million a piece, and that's it. You don't expect to get them back. You're not going to lose a pilot. You're not going to do anything like that with them.
It's smart, isn't it? I mean, easy
So
is
it's cheap, it's
one way.
easy.
It's smart way to take out an enemy.
Right.
But it has a problem, and as we saw in that case, was that they missed him because they didn't have any capability to retarget or to redirect or call it off if the Z
A
is not
weakness
there.
of the technology?
Of the technology at the time, to a certain extent. Now, with the current UAV technology, if you had a human in the loop, you might
Redirect
the mission. You might be able to find him. Of course, it's all the same advantages that any human in the loop brings to a problem.
But I think, like I said, I think the real issue is how we've utilized the technology, not, like I said, the technology itself. If the Constitution...
But are we overutilizing it? I mean, should we not be dropping bombs in Yemen, in Pakistan, unless we have congressional
If you believe
approval?
war is the last step, that everything should be exhausted before war, which is what the framers of the country believe. That's why they made it so difficult to declare war.
Right.
They gave the president the ability to wage war in our defense, but not to wage war, proactively.
Right.
And so they made it impossible for the president to declare war on his own because they cannot leave this to one man. It was the country's decision. Congress is the only one that has the power to declare war.
Now,
Yeah, if President Clinton had been successful in killing Osama bin Laden in the 90s, we would have, we might have known it, have possibly averted a huge attack against the U.S.
That's certainly true, and there is some security balances, but that's why the country has to decide that, not one man, the president, saying, I'm just going to go and send a drone strike.
I'm not an expert on the legal stuff of this, but I understand that the Obama administration is currently still relying to some degree on a congressional approval that went back to right after September 11th that gave the Bush administration at the time the power to launch attacks against anyone that they thought was connected to Al-Qaeda or anyone who had anything to do with the September 11th attacks. So it was very much tied at the time, the
Correct.
congressional approval to those September 11th
However,
attacks. Now, I mean, is that dimming as time goes on? Can that ever sunset, so to speak?
The problem is that Congress can't do that.
Uh-huh.
Congress can declare war, and the president can wage it. Congress cannot give up its ability to make that decision to some other branch. The Supreme Court's upheld this every time it's come to it.
Right.
That the legislature cannot delegate its authorities granted to it by the Constitution to another branch. They have to declare the war, not say, well, it's okay, we'll fund it, you do what you want.
Right.
They can't do that.
Except in this case, if the two branches agree, then who's going to?
Yeah.
But if they agreed, they would have declared war. They didn't.
I like your constitutional argument, but the real politic is that Congress, even though it has the power to rise up and say no appropriation, Congress, if they are generally supportive of that president, aren't they going to go ahead, appropriate the funds to conduct the undeclared war?
Well, I think that's
In other words, they
point.
control the purse strings, right?
And they always have, but
Yeah.
that's exactly the point. They can control the purse strings without having political accountability, which is exactly the opposite of what the Constitution was set up for.
I agree.
It was set up so that political leaders, if they declared war, they had to be accountable for that.
Right.
And as unpopular as Bush was because of the war, you know, had Congress declared war, that would have been across all of Congress, not just on Bush's
Right.
footsteps.
And yet,
or
Congress did authorize the invasion of Iraq.
I agree.
And I think that's a case where a declaration of war probably would have been appropriate if you're going to do it. But what about a case where, okay, you're conducting strikes in Pakistan with the agreement of the Pakistani government against individuals who are not representative of the Pakistani government? Who do you declare war against?
But
in
that is
case?
a different situation if the other government's asking you to do that. If you're going out, and an example, the Pakistan, when we captured bin Laden, we did not have permission to go there to capture him. That in
Not
itself
from
is an act
Pakistan.
of war. I'm sorry.
It was certainly an act. Whether it's an act of war is all in the eyes of the beholder.
Agreed, but we violated their sovereign airspace without their invitation.
That's true.
Normally is an act of war. Congress is the only one that can authorize that, not the president taking unilateral
Right,
action.
and I take your constitutional argument too, and I think it's a very powerful one. But there is this argument that says, look, isn't terrorism a kind of game changer? I mean, that we are in this different world now because there are non-state actors littered across the globe. You know,
But it's not
I mean,
new.
maybe Congress should reiterate what they did after September 11th and say we authorize the president to continue to use
But that
drone
is not
strikes.
new. Terrorism
across the,
and non-nations are not new. We had piracy when we started this country,
Right,
and we
right.
had letters of marque and reprisal where we allowed private individuals to go after those
And yet there was
people.
no declaration of war.
What's that?
There was no declaration.
There's
of
no
war.
declaration of war because letters of marque and reprisal are individual citizens, not the government.
Oh, but the
acting.
U.S. Navy went. Thomas Jefferson sent the U.S. Navy against the Barbary pirates.
That's true.
Which you
But
would
that
call
was
an act of war, but there was no.
Not in
declaration of
international
war.
water. It's just not.
That's kind of a
On
stretch.
coast. Well, no, that's just the way the international laws read. International waters is not an act of war unless it's against a sovereign nation. Pirates were not a member of a sovereign nation, so we had terrorism
actually
then.
invaded North Africa in that case. We sent raids ashore.
Well, you're talking recently when
No,
we
no,
went to
no.
North
I'm
Africa.
talking Thomas Jefferson's action.
Let me ask this question: if the
Right.
in the world of drones, is their utilization going to increase these potential risk of going across the border of that country that we have no permission to cross that border? Does that drone encroachment, is that an act of war?
Every much as a manned aircraft would be.
Yes.
If it's an aircraft under the control of our government, if it's entering somebody else's airspace without permission, then it's at least an unfriendly act.
Right, but this does go, it seems, back to Gary's point that because drones are much easier for us to use than to actually send in. I mean, maybe it's not that much difference to send in a manned pilot, but still, it creates this creep, so to speak, that it just makes it like, well, why not send in drones into that area
You can
too?
depersonalize.
Right, and it really, then it becomes a question of power, it seems to me, that we can do that as the United States because we're the most powerful country,
Well,
and you know, if someone did that to us,
piece
we
of it,
would be
though,
quite
is
irritated, but...
is that these things are, the current technology they're not really very good at penetrating any kind of air defense system. So if the country you're sending them into wants to shoot them down, they probably can. And one advantage of that is that they'd probably be more willing to shoot down an unmanned aircraft than one that has a pilot in it. Because if you kill an American, it's probably more implications than shooting down a predator that lets everybody pretend it didn't happen.
How, just out of curiosity, I had a sense that drones were used fairly widely in Libya when we sent in. I mean, we sent in some fighter planes, but we also sent in drones, correct?
I actually don't know any details of that operation.
I mean, my guess is they would have. I mean, it makes sense that they would send an unmanned aircraft into that area. But again, I don't know that that's been released. Whether or not how much they've used and what utilization.
But you know, you might have heard, you might not have heard. If some had been shot down, you probably wouldn't have heard about it. Wouldn't have made the news.
But let me ask you this question too, Paul. I mean, is there a sense that there's going to be, from here on out, or at least as far as the eye can see into the future, there's going to be terrorism across the terrorists littered across the globe, and we're just going to be having drone strikes against them forever? Or is there a time when it's like, well, now we're done. Like, now we've basically beat Al Qaeda, or now we've done our job for the most part. Yeah, there's still maybe a terrorist that could pop up here and there, but we're out of it. Or is this just a kind of a continual, so to speak, police action that we're going to be doing forever, in the way that crime is always going to, thieves are always going to be there, and police are always going to be trying to hunt them down?
Just like you put it, the question's bigger than the technology that's used to fight terrorism. We talk about the war on terrorism, but terrorism is a tactic, not an enemy. So you're probably not really ever going to win a war on terrorism. You may win the war against a specific opponent, but to say that the terrorism will someday be over is pretty optimistic.
And I think, to your point, it kind of answers the question if you look at the legislation recently passed that allows the military to do some arrest powers on U.S. soil, drones in U.S. airspace. I think you can see that politicians do not want to put their name on something that would be bad, so they just do it through this funding channel and say, yeah, go ahead. And they rarely put something out there that says, yeah, we stand behind this.
I think history is a good lesson here. In the 50s, looking for communists under every rock, and the perception that there was some monolithic guy sitting in Moscow controlling every communist around the globe drove our foreign policy for decades, probably got us into Vietnam to begin with. I think there is time to pause as a country and say, Al-Qaeda, is it some monolithic enemy out there, or is it a group of disaffected people scattered around with many dissimilar viewpoints?
I mean, another way of framing my question, Robert E. Lee, I think, famously said something along the lines of, it's good that war is so horrible, or else we would grow too fond of it. Is there a possibility that drones can make war sufficiently unhorrible from at least our perspective, that we grow so fond of it that it just never quite goes away? I mean, maybe this is a good thing. I mean, like I said, maybe, like I said, if we're policing the world and protecting our own borders, maybe that's not so bad.
Can I answer that question by pointing to a Star Trek reference? There's an episode in Star Trek where they come across the planet. And they're waging war, and they're doing it all virtually, and people go report to these death stations.
They basically like play Battleship, and then if you get bombed, you have to walk to the little death station. It's totally clean. But if I remember right, they have to end by like reintroducing
the horror
of war. Because otherwise it will
go forever. They had no incentive to stop the war. And I think that's what we see ourselves in now. With Congress not declaring war, we just keep getting into more and more actions without having any repercussions or discussions.
But what about the idea that we're protecting ourselves from, I mean, there are people who are going to launch terrorist attacks, and we're protecting ourselves.
I don't disagree, but like you said, you're going to find the Reds, the terrorists under every single nook and cranny every time you go looking for them.
If you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
That's right.
If you ask the Marines that went to Fallujah, or if if a war broke out, God forbid, on the Korean Peninsula, I think we'd find the horrors of war are they're still around.
Quite nasty. Well, what about one subject we haven't talked about that we only have about 4 or 5 minutes left, but that I think we should talk about is, the CIA uses drones as well as the military. Does that pose another problem? I mean, we think of the military as being publicly accountable in a way that the CIA is not, and yet the CIA is also responsible for a lot of drone strikes. Is that problematic? Is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, I would say the CIA has always presented some extra challenges for us. I mean,
Right.
if they subcontract out the job to some private entity to fly the drone and carry off the attack hit, yeah, I'd say it's a big problem. We want to know what's going on, I think, as a country. By and large, we have a right to know what's going on, and there are good arguments you can make for certain confidential information for the security of the country. But I think once you put drones in the hands of surveillance type agencies, you're inviting more problems.
Specifically armed drones, really. Surveillance is not necessarily as problematic.
right.
It's still an unfriendly act, as you mentioned, but it's not a weapon platform, if you will. But I think the bigger problem still occurs that the Constitution, there's nowhere in the Constitution other than declaring war that the United States has the authority by its own stature to carry out attacks on anyone. The whole point of due process applies to anyone the government comes in contact with. That is the point. That's why the declaration of war is so important, because it suspends certain things that the United States has to do. And without doing that, that's why we get into trouble of, well, what do you do about Gitmo? What do you do about, combatants, not people that you're at war with, but combatants. That's why we come into these situations where administrations have to figure legal maneuvery around what the Constitution put in place in the first place.
Right.
And the good news is the CIA is accountable to Congress, just like the DoD is. And the DoD is not necessarily any more accountable to the public than the CIA is. They have their secrets too.
Right.
And far more accountable today, I think, than perhaps 40 or 50 years ago.
Yeah.
When they were really running their own enterprise.
Right.
Although I will say that the CIA has introduced things that the DoD has been resistant to technology-wise, and it's been on more than one occasion once the CIA has some success with something, the Air Force or the Navy or some other branch of the service takes it over just because they were surprised at how successful it was.
Right. Well, we only have a few seconds left, but I want to ask you, Paul, in particular, because you've dealt with these. Are there any rules that you'd like to see in place with drones that are not yet currently in place? Is there anything that we could be doing better with the use of drone technology, more ethically?
I'd like to. My personal opinion is I think we need to make sure we keep a human in a loop, or at least think really hard about what the consequences will be if we ever have to operate without a human in the loop, which could happen in a future war if we are not careful.
Right, right. Bob, same question to you, real quick.
I like Paul's point. I'd also favor conscription. And no longer voluntary service. Let's make a commitment to the country.
Right. Okay, well, I'm afraid we're out of time. I mean, this is such an interesting topic, and of course we also have the issue of the domestic use of drones. You brought that up, and maybe that will be a subject for a future show, but I think we've gotten at least a good start of a conversation going, and I think, Bob, you had said that it's important for us as a country, as a community, to think about what we're doing, the use of technology that we're using. Is it constitutional? What are the rights of people around the world, and how are we supposed to sort out all this stuff as we get these new technological powers? But I think that the conversation we've started is one that I hope that you can continue in your homes and communities, and I'd like to thank you all for a really stimulating discussion.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay,
Thank you.
well, thank you. And we'll see you next time on Ethical Perspectives on the News.